All right, well, thank you everyone for being here for this presentation on women's rights, the inimitable Theodosia Ammons. In the history of women's suffrage, Colorado holds a unique and significant position, the first state to enact women's suffrage by popular referendum. On November 7th, 1893, Colorado women won an incredible victory when the male voters of the state passed by a 55% majority the referendum giving women the right to vote. There were many women and men who were involved in achieving this success, but one woman in particular gives us a fascinating look at understanding the social issues that affected women's lives at the turn of the 20th century. That woman, Theodosia Ammons, broke barriers with her distinguished academic career, was a leader in the Colorado women's suffrage movement, used her creativity and innovation to build a model cottage at the Colorado Chautauqua, which she used to free women from domestic drudgery. Theodosia Ammons was born in 1861 in North Carolina. She was born the same year Colorado was opened up as a territory in February 1861. Theodosia was the second oldest of 5 children and the oldest girl. And you can see her pictured here on this slide on the far left with her 3 sisters, Farida, Annie, and Gwendolyn. Theodosia was born during the Civil War in a southern state. And even though she would have been very young at this time, we can only imagine how the war would have affected her childhood as it did with so many others. And 10 years later, in 1871, after Colorado became a territory and 5 years before it became a state, Theodosia moved to Denver with her family. Now, they would have been part of a migration to the West for families, particularly the white middle class, looking for jobs and land. And by 1871, Colorado would have been considered a lot safer to move to, since the American Indian population, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Comanche, were mostly eliminated by the end of the Civil War. Part of what was known as manifest destiny during this mid to late 19th century, or this belief that the expansion of the US throughout the continent was justified. But it also gave this important opportunity to acquire land through the Homestead Act, which especially was important because it allowed women to own land. Theodosia and her siblings all homesteaded on land in the South Platte drainage west of Denver. Now, Theodosia was a young girl, really just a teenager, when women in Colorado made their first attempt at getting the right to vote included in the state constitution in 1876. Now, Theodosia was undoubtedly an intelligent young woman, as evidenced by her success during the later years of her life. So she very well could have been closely following the attempts by Colorado women to secure their right to vote. And perhaps she wondered what that success would mean for her, a young girl on the cusp of adulthood who really did not have all that many opportunities outside of getting married and staying in the home. And one of the beliefs that really defined this time period in the late 19th century, especially for the white middle class, was this concept of separate spheres ideology. It was the belief that women's domain was in the home, while men's domain was in the public. And part of this belief was that women really should not be doing much outside of the home, including working, participating in politics, speaking in public, and so forth. And this ideology is really important for understanding why women's suffrage was considered such a threat by so many. People, both men and women, feared it would upset this balance and destroy these social norms. If women were going out into the public, who would take care of the home? And I like to use this political cartoon a lot, even though it is from many years after the time period we are talking about, from 1909. It is, I think, really exemplifies exactly this kind of fear. This is why women's suffrage was considered such a radical idea. Because as you can see and depicted in this cartoon, as this wife and mother is going off, obviously, to do her voting, the husband and father is left at home having to deal with 2 crying babies and dishes and so forth to take care of. And so this was part of what was feeding into this the resistance to giving women the right to vote. Now, Theodosia graduated from high school into this belief system in 1883, which means she would have been 20, 21, 22 years old, which is quite late for a high school student. But this is because Theodosia had to help the family earn income. And she also had to help take care of her siblings while her parents worked, since she was the oldest girl and her youngest sister, Gwendolyn, was 17 years younger than her. And upon graduation from high school, Theodosia did not attend college, again, due to financial challenges. Instead, she went into teaching. And teaching was one of the few opportunities that women had for working outside the home. Schools were really considered this extension of the home, thus making it appropriate for single women, not married, to work in them. But back to that attempt at suffrage for women in 1876. In the lead up to Colorado becoming a state that year in 1876, Colorado women fought to have their right to vote included in the state constitution. As with other states entering the Union at this time, there was a concern by the state legislators that their request for statehood would be denied if they had a constitution that allowed for women to vote. And I know this in part because in my dissertation research, I also looked at Kansas, the history of Kansas. And so right next door, Kansas faced a similar dilemma to Colorado in 1861. At that same time, Kansas women fought to have their right to vote included in the state constitution. But similar to Colorado women in 1876, 15 years later, women were denied full voting rights in Kansas because men were worried that this constitutional attempt, which by 1861 was their fourth attempt, would again be rejected if they had the right to vote for women included. Now, Wyoming is the exception to this, and really pretty remarkable when you realize this resistance that was occurring in other states, because it gave women the right to vote when it became a territory in 1869, and then kept that in its state constitution in 1890. And I found this wood engraving on Library of Congress website that really depicts this phenomenal 1869 achievement when Wyoming women and the territory got the right to vote. So Colorado women were not successful in 1876. They did get some important successes that year. One of them was the right to vote in school board elections. Again, thinking about the school being considered an extension of the home, this was more appropriate, considered to be a more appropriate place where women could be involved and including where they could vote. Same thing happened in 1861, actually, in Kansas, where women did not get full voting rights, but they did get the right to vote in school board elections. The other thing that Colorado women got in 1876 was the addition of Article 7, Section 2, which stated they would only need a simple majority by the electorate to pass women's suffrage. This latter item would end up being hugely significant in 1893. So even though at the time, maybe it did not seem like much to Colorado women, these were two successes. Now, the following year, in 1877, Colorado women tried again to get the right to vote. And there had not been many states who had attempted to give women full voting rights by this time. So Colorado came under the attention of national leaders, who many have traveled to the state in 1877 to help campaign for the vote. Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone being two of those national leaders. They did a lot of work. They campaigned around the state, both national leaders and state leaders, but women lost again in 1877. And the Colorado legislature refused to authorize another popular referendum for women's suffrage for 15 years. So how aware was Theodosia of all of this suffrage work? We don't know. But what we do know is that by the time the next campaign for suffrage rolled around, Theodosia's name was connected to the movement, and she would go on to have an impact on the state and national suffrage organizations. So 15 years later, 1893, Colorado women finally had their chance again at getting the right to vote. And this was due to several factors. Governor John Rout, who is pictured here on the screen, who had been integral in supporting women's suffrage in 1876 and in 1877, when he was his first tenure as governor, was again elected governor in the early 1890s. and he again advocated for women's suffrage. And soon after he left office, a bill was passed by the Colorado legislature to put the question of women's suffrage before the male electorate that year. This was in part thanks to the governor's efforts, but also because of the rise and success of the Populist Party, which, in addition to its pro-silver plank, supported women's suffrage. Now, Governor John Rout was a significant figure in the fight for women's suffrage in Colorado, but we can't forget about his wife, Eliza, who deserves as much or more recognition for the role she played in securing women's rights to vote in Colorado. Now, Eliza is also important to our story about Theodosia because the two women went on to start the Department of Domestic Economy at Colorado Agricultural College just a few years after this victory in 1893. I'll be talking more about that in a little bit. Now, they likely met through their mutual work in the suffrage movement and their involvement in the nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association. Now, Eliza was several years older than Theodosia. She was born in 1839 in Illinois and married John Rout when she was 35 years old. And that would have been pretty old for this time for a woman to get married. And they got married in 1874. Now, John had been previously married. He was actually a widower when they got married with 5 children by the time that they met. He was also 13 years older than Eliza, which again, I don't think was overly uncommon during this time. One of the women that I research and look at in Lawrence had this very similar story. She was older when she was married, and she married, her husband was several years older than her, and during the same time period. Now, John was appointed territorial governor of Colorado in 1875 by President Ulysses Grant. And so the couple moved to Colorado. And it's really quite impressive when you think about these two who would have been outsiders in Colorado, having just arrived in 1875, having the significant impact that they did so immediately on the state. Because both of them threw themselves into suffrage work, bringing in Susan B. Anthony to help campaign in 1877. And even after the failure, they continued to support the women's vote, even through those 15 years when nothing was happening at the state level. And so when John was elected governor again in 1891, the couple had the opportunity to use this highest elected office in the state to their advantage. So the 1893 campaign was not easy, nor was there a lot of optimism on the part of national leaders that Colorado would be victorious. When I was doing my research and looking at a comparison between Kansas and Colorado, I was honestly surprised to find that at this time in 1893, how many national leaders did not think that Colorado had a chance. One of them said, when in a letter writing to one of the suffrage leaders in the state, "Why was your campaign precipitated when our hands are so full?" Now, what the suffrage leader was referring to is that in 1893, Colorado was competing with 2 other states who were both also undergoing statewide campaigns for women's suffrage, New York and Kansas. And both of these campaigns, I'm quoting here from this, the suffrage leader said, they are considered very hopeful compared to what was thought in the East to be the almost hopeless campaign in Colorado. And part of that, I just find this really amazing because, of course, Colorado has this badge of victory for being this first state to pass women's suffrage by popular referendum. And to see in these letters and in this communication between the state and national leaders that they really did not believe in Colorado, but they did believe in Kansas. And this is actually because Kansas had just passed municipal suffrage a few years before in 1887, which at that point was the most significant suffrage accomplishment in the country. And so they really believed that Kansas was the state that was going to see this momentum continue. And Kansas was going to have in 1894 its attempt at giving women the right to vote, full suffrage rights in the state. Thus, the concern that Colorado would be too distracting. So Carrie Chapman Catt, You may know her name because, and she's come up a lot if you've been following anything around the 19th Amendment and the commemorations this year. She was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed and ratified. But at the time in 1893, she really was not yet this established national leader that she would become. And yet she was the one tasked with working with Colorado, which is funny because we at the time we know what Carrie Chapman Catt became, and we know that she was this really effective leader. But at the time, I think you can imagine Susan B. Anthony sending this new woman, Carrie Chapman Catt, who really hadn't established herself yet. She's the one that was communicating with Colorado, and she's the one that ended up helping them, kind of the lowest, the person in the rankings. And so Carrie Chapman Catt says that I have talked with no one who feels there is the slightest hope of success in Colorado. And Kansas, again, was their last hope. And I mean, spoiler, you may or may not know Kansas history, but they didn't get it in 1894. And so it was just really amazing turning the tables, you could say, that Colorado did win and Kansas didn't. And so she said it would be embarrassing to women if they were unable to follow up with full suffrage after their victory at partial suffrage. And Catt explained, if they failed in Kansas in 1894, no attempt will be made again to carry on a campaign of that sort for years to come. And so you can just see there was all this really massive resistance that Colorado women were facing to try to get help from the national leadership to get the financial support and the speakers they needed to help organize. So despite all of that, and of course, I just read a lot of reluctance to you from these letters, Colorado women, they did finally convince the national leadership to send them some help and some money, and they worked furiously during the year of 1893 to secure the vote. And they had a variety of strategies. They organized different groups, including Black women's clubs. They enlisted the help of newspapers to help spread the word, and they tied themselves to the populace, the plank of free silver, stating that if women had the right to vote, they could help vote in support for that issue. And all of those strategies worked. And they won with a 55% majority. And this is thanks to that Article 7 from 1876, when the state constitution was passed, that said that they needed a simple majority. If they hadn't had that, they would not have been successful. Now, one of the first notable steps that Colorado women took, and this is something that I discovered, again, doing my research when I was visiting Boulder a few years ago. I saw this newspaper article and it really stood out to me because what they're doing here is some of these women in the nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association, these newly elected officers in 1894, they are redefining their identities in the context of their newly acquired political rights. And they're saying that in recognition of their freedom and independence, the married women of the association decided to abandon the initials of their husbands and take their own. And so instead we have Mrs. Eliza Rout, we have Mrs. Mary Carr, Mrs. Mary Telford, and so on and so forth. And of course, Miss Theodosia Ammons. And this might not sound like a lot to us today, but this was actually a really radically significant action on the part of these women, especially the married ones, because it was not so many years before that a woman would lose her identity, her right to property, her guardianship rights over children once she got married. And while many states were overturning those kind of laws throughout the late 19th century, really starting with the 1848 Married Women's Property Act in New York, there were still customs and expectations regarding married women. And one of these was that women did not go by their names. They were known by their husbands' names, which actually makes it really difficult to do women's history because you lose that thread of the woman's name when she gets married. And so this announcement by these women in 1894 underscored they were full and equal citizens under the law, and they would be known as such. And so Theodosia was one of the officers in the nonpartisan Equal Suffrage Association. And in 1894, she would have been 33 years old. And she was newly elected as secretary in this association, along with her friend Eliza, who was elected president. And Theodosia was almost certainly part of the 1893 campaign. And she likely picked up many organizing strategies and leadership skills from her work in the suffrage organization, which she would draw on throughout the rest of her life. And one area in her life that had especially tremendous impact was domestic science. Now, domestic science was a fast growing field at the turn of the 20th century, giving women the opportunity to gain professional skills. And it reinforced a connection between women and the home, which is really important, thinking that separate spheres ideology and the belief that women's place was in the home. But it also gave women the latest technologies for running a household. And as with many social and reform issues of the day, there was also this element of uplifting the white race, even within the science of housework. And in 1901, at the Colorado Chautauqua, Emma Ewing, who was a domestic science professor, gave a talk on domestic science in the household. She argued, quote, homemaking is the most important industry in the world, as it is the heart of society where good or evil influences that could lift up or drag down society radiate into the world. And Ewing really wanted white middle class women to learn how to do their own housework, as the quote, unintelligent foreigner was responsible for the continued degradation of housework. So, after this initial connection to science and scientific training, domestic science evolved to become home economics, which I think it was for years and years before it changed the name again more recently, I believe, to like family and consumer science. But it became part of so many public school curriculums. But with that transition, there was actually a diminishing of women's work. And because there was a lessening of this connection between women's work and science, and there was more of a reinforcement between women's appropriate work being in the house. And as you heard from a couple of the quotes I just said earlier, domestic science also had these racist underpinnings and was often used as this weapon against immigrant and working class women because they did not have the time or the means to take care of their households in the scientific way that was being promoted through the teachings of domestic science. So this was an example of something of many of the reforms that came out of especially the progressive era that had these roots and kind of uplifting, upholding this white middle class, especially, which also kept working class and immigrants in a lower place. Now, this photograph is not a picture of a domestic science class at the Chautauqua, and it's from several years later, 1923, but it depicts what I think a typical domestic science class would have looked like during this time. Now, as a teacher, Theodosia developed an interest in women's education, particularly in domestic science. And in 1895, as I mentioned earlier, she and her fellow suffragist Eliza Rout co-founded the Department of Domestic Economy at the Colorado Agricultural College in Fort Collins. So Theodosia was a woman who broke barriers. That's something that was very clear to me early on in my research. And she demonstrated this in many areas of her life. And one of the barriers she broke was when she became the first female faculty member at the Colorado Agricultural College. Then, just a few years later, in 1902, she broke yet another barrier at that school because when she became the first female dean in the school's history. Really remarkable. And again, to be thinking about, as I said, when she graduated from high school in 1883, graduating into this world that really upheld these beliefs about women's place and appropriate roles, and not really being out in the public in these prominent ways. And Theodosia to establish this and these roles as both a faculty member and a dean by 1902 is really remarkable. And so while she was dean, Theodosia changed the name from the Department of Domestic Economy to the Department of Domestic Science. And her focus on science was a way to reinforce the women's work was supported by scientific methods. And it was this connection to science that really helped support the value of women's education. So in addition to teaching at the Colorado Agricultural College, Theodosia also led and managed the School of Domestic Science at the Colorado Chautauqua. And you can see her pictured here. Over on the right, there's a green arrow pointing down above her head. She's standing over there, second from the right. And so in the School of Domestic Science, it covered a lot of subjects, a lot of things, everything having to do with the home. But it included things such as plumbing, the heating and lighting of the home, landscaping, furnishing, disinfecting, food preparation, really anything you could think of to need to run and take care of a home. But the main focus was really cooking and serving. And there was equipment that students could actually use and practice with on the grounds. And the course was open to anyone, but the Colorado Chautauqua really especially encouraged teachers to attend, explaining that studying the home is important since, I'm quoting here, the home is the center of civilization. And I think that is an important quote to bring up. This is how the Colorado Chautauqua was promoting and marketing domestic science classes at the time, because this wording of civilization ties to what I said earlier about this understanding of domestic science and kind of this underpinning of what it promoted and what was upholding, really these white middle class values. And so most of the programming, because it was learning how to take care of your home, it was obviously directed at women, but men were allowed to attend if they would like to. Um, but because of the topic material focusing on cooking and sewing, you can imagine most of the domestic science classes were women. Now, the way Theodosia was able to teach her students and provide this hands-on opportunity was because of a model cottage, Gwenthean, that she designed and built on the Chautauqua grounds. And you are going to get a special look at Gwenthean Cottage at the end of this talk and see, thanks to Catherine Long Gates, how Theodosia used her creativity and intelligence to design this innovative cottage. And Theodosia also had a team of teachers, female teachers, to help her deliver lectures, teach courses, again, all sorts of different topics, ranging from architecture, plumbing, and theories of the diet, art of conversation, and so forth. And Ammons, to me, I think really did this amazing job of pairing the traditionally masculine traits, or considered more masculine traits of force, originality, executive ability, with this emphasis on developing the health and welfare of the individuals and community, which were typically considered feminine traits or feminine concerns. And so domestic science trained women for roles that it could be outside the home. It wouldn't have to be that they stayed within the home, but they still use the domestic science in these classes still use this conventional gendered language to reinforce the work that was traditionally associated with women. And one of the things that I found most amazing really was when I was going through, and it was kind of a funny place to find something so significant, but was the minutes of the board of directors meetings. And in these minutes, I see that they are discussing, of course, an all male board of directors, they're discussing different salaries for some of the faculty at the Colorado Chautauqua. And from there, I was able to deduce that Theodosia really negotiated her salary with the management. And I saw how she was able to navigate this male dominated board, convince them to hire her, and argued not just for the monetary value of herself, but of her teachers as well. And Theodosia had a higher salary than some of the other female instructors, and even some of the male instructors. She wasn't the highest paid instructor, but I think it's important to know that she negotiated her position, her salaries for herself and her female instructors, because it shows how she navigated this male dominated world of negotiation, salaries, applying those very teachings she was teaching her students in domestic science of force, originality, and executive ability. And so you can see here a copy of that very contract from 1903, where it's explaining exactly what Theodosia was going to get in terms of the percentage of receipts and any travel reimbursement and so forth. All of that was in there, and on all of that, she helped to negotiate. Now, in addition to her groundbreaking work with the field of domestic science, Theodosia, as you heard already, was actively involved in Colorado's women's suffrage movement. She more than likely participated in the 1893 victory. She was an officer in 1894 of the Equal Suffrage Association, and her suffrage work did not end there. Her suffrage work and the suffrage work by Colorado in general. So women got the vote in 1893, but they didn't stop pushing for suffrage. And in fact, In 1902, Theodosia was elected president of the Colorado Equal Suffrage Association. So they continue to have this this group, this association, even almost 10 years after having the right to vote. And because of her position as president, Theodosia spoke at the conference for the National American Woman Suffrage Association that year in 1902. And during her speech, Ammons reassures the crowd that equal suffrage had not upturned established gender roles in Colorado, neither lessening the chivalry of men nor prompting women to neglect their homes. Think about that political cartoon I showed you. They're not neglecting their homes, she says. She used her model home at Chautauqua as this example of how they continue to teach young women to be good homemakers using scientific study and the very best methods of housekeeping. And at that same conference, that same year, Theodosia reported that women getting the vote had actually increased attention to homemaking and improved sanitation, which actually led to jobs for women. So expanding the roles, it's if you can think about it, how domestic science was a way to create more outlets from the home, kind of branching off from the home, leading to more jobs for women. And one in particular, interesting, is that there was a fuel and iron company in Colorado who employed women as instructors in the science of nutrition and domestic science. And they would teach at these different camps. And these women teachers were especially important, according to Ammons, since they were teaching, as she said, foreigners who needed such instruction most. Now, this is something that, again, it's women are working outside the home. We hear in this language about, who needs this instruction most, who's able to teach it, who needs it. Kind of still, and this is very much we're into the early 20th century, getting into that progressive era type of language and reforms. So just being to think about how domestic science was used as a tool, again, to promote very white middle class type of uplift and values. But women also, as you hear, had these new and unique opportunities for jobs. And something else connected to suffrage. Theodosia was really instrumental in organizing a suffrage day at the Colorado Chautauqua in 1902. And this was really interesting to me because here we have one of the things that I studied in my dissertation was to see how suffrage eventually got onto the platform in Chautauqua, because when Chautauqua started in New York in 1874, the founder John Vincent not only did not want suffrage to be included, he didn't want women to speak from the platform at all. And women pushed against that, and they were able to break through, and they began speaking from the platform really early on, starting in 1876. But it took almost 15 years before women were able to talk about women's suffrage. Not until 1890, and this is at the New York Chautauqua. And what I found, I traced through this, and I saw like what women had to do and what they said in order to get this victory, but it was really hard fought. And what happened, like once New York broke, you could say, like once Vincent broke down and said, okay, you can have suffrage, other Chautauqua assemblies, because there were many of them across the country, followed suit. And I saw this in Kansas and one of the other Chautauquas I studied. But what's interesting is in Boulder, the Colorado Chautauqua, it started in 1898, and it started after women had already had the vote. And so I didn't necessarily expect to see suffrage days. Like I saw them in other states like Kansas, where suffragists were using the Chautauqua as a way to campaign to get women the right to vote. They already had it in Colorado. So I was surprised to see in 1902 that Theodosia had organized this. But she explained when actually the following year in 1903, she goes back to the convention and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she reports on why. Why did Colorado Chautauqua have a suffrage day, even though Colorado women had the right to vote for 10 years? She says, since there are so many Southerners attending the Chautauqua, we put forth every effort to make it of value to them. So this is obviously an acknowledgement of the Texas visitors who were coming up to attend the Chautauqua. Texas women did not get the right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So what this shows is that this is an example of how Colorado women continue to fight for women's suffrage by helping other states. And it really also, suffrage days were not just for Southern visitors. And even though women had the right to vote in Colorado, that didn't mean there wasn't work to be done. And Theodosia reported that when she attended both in 1902 and 1903, these national conventions, and said that in 1902, there were more women serving on state boards, several women who had been members of the State House of Representatives, and there was hope that a woman would soon be in the state Senate, although it would take another 10 years still for that to happen. And there were, in 1903, 14 different bills pending in the legislature relating to women and children, all of which Theodosia said were supported by women's clubs and other organizations. And so people from other states were looking to Colorado as the example of whether women should or should not have the right to vote. So Theodosia was standing up there and saying, look at all of these great accomplishments that we have done in a decade of women having the vote. But she, of course, noted there was still plenty of work to be done.